The 100 Years' War, a prolonged series of conflicts lasting between 1337 to 1453, primarily fought between England and France. This struggle was ignited by disputes over territorial claims and the legitimacy of the French throne, particularly after Edward III of England claimed the French crown, citing his mother's lineage as the basis for his right to rule. The war saw several pivotal battles, including Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt, which highlighted the evolving nature of medieval warfare, notably increasing importance of infantry and the use of the longbow. The conflict eventually culminated in the rise of French nationalism and the solidification of a more centralized French state under Charles VII, significantly aided by figures such as Joan of Arc, whose involvement became a turning point in the war and a lasting symbol of French unity and resilience. Hello and welcome to the channel. If you're new here, it's good to meet you, and if you're coming back, good to see you again. As always, if you like what I do, there's a link to a Patreon in the description. Otherwise, liking the video and leaving your comments down below helps YouTube show other people. Now, if you're after something quintessentially medieval, you're certainly in the right place. The 100 Years' War. Figures like Edward III, the Black Prince, and Joan of Arc, knights and battles and castles, it has it all. Thus, the video is going to be in 2 parts, just so we can make it as detailed as possible. Of course, a war of this magnitude could have 10, 15, 20 parts, but I'm going to try and keep it just to 2 parts, for all of our sakes. Now, without further ado, I would like you to become relaxed, take a deep breath, and we can begin. When Charles IV of France died in the year 1328, Edward III of England was the closest male relative, through his mother Isabella, Charles' sister. The legal question at hand was whether Isabella could pass on a claim she herself could not hold, as succession laws restricted the crown to male heirs. The French aristocracy instead chose Philip, the Count of Valois, Charles IV's first cousin, to become King Philip VI, setting a precedent for the French crown's succession that Edward III and his descendants would contest for generations. Initially quite hesitant, the young Edward III, aged 17, and Duke of Aquitaine, formally paid homage to Philip VI in 1329. Gascony, a significant part of Aquitaine in southwestern France, was pivotal economically due to its claret wine trade with England, which the English had gained quite a taste for, thus bringing considerable revenue to the English crown. Now, the Gascons, having distinct language and customs, preferred the more hands-off governance of their distant English king over the more direct control of a French monarch. Despite Edward's homage, the French continued to meddle in Gascon affairs, including military skirmishes and bureaucratic pressures in the region, especially in the French-controlled area of Agincourt. Additionally, the French summoned support from local lords for potential conflicts, indicating ongoing tensions despite Edward's formal submission. The broader politics of the landscape was also tense. During the 1330s, France supported Scotland, England's adversary, complicating relations even further. In Flanders, while the cities relied on English wool and favoured England, the nobility was pro-French. The situation escalated when Philip VI gathered a fleet for a crusade, later repurposed as a threat in the English Channel, signaling aggressive intentions towards their northern neighbours. Influential in Edward's court was Robert III of Artois, an exile from the French court due to a dispute with Philip VI. In 1336, Philip demanded Robert's extradition from Gascony, threatening severe consequences. This demand, coupled with the confiscation of Edward's territories in Gascony and Poitiers the following year, was cited as a direct cause for escalating conflict. The seizure of Gascony by Philip VI in 1337 marked a critical moment, prompting Edward III to devise a military strategy aimed at maintaining English control in Gascony while also preparing an invasion from the north. This dual approach was to be supported by a broad alliance of continental allies, to whom Edward pledged over £200,000, an amount that is equivalent to around £65 million today. I believe that's about 70 million US dollars, something like that. To fund this costly venture, Edward capitalized on England's wool trade, planning to sell 30,000 sacks through English merchants to generate an estimated £200,000, which would be loaned to him for the war effort. Additionally, substantial loans were secured from major banking houses like Bardi and Peruzzi, and later, in a financial crunch, the merchant William de la Pole provided a crucial lifeline with a £110,000 advance, pulled from his buddies who were also other English merchants. Edward's financial strategies extended to high-interest loans from Low Countries merchants, who demanded solid repayment assurances, resulting in the Earls of Derby and Northampton being held as collateral. In 1339, Edward requested a £300,000 grant from the Commons, which they eventually offered in exchange for concessions. These financial maneuvers delayed Edward's invasion plans, providing the French with an opportunity to redirect their resources and also launch an offensive into Gascony in December of 1338, capturing Saint-Macaire and Blaye. Oliver Ingham, the Seneschal of Gascony, faced the daunting task of defending the region with limited local resources and without reinforcements from England. His strategy largely consisted of retreating to fortifications and enduring the siege while managed to secure allegiance of the Lord Albret in 1339, which allowed for some offensive raids into French territory. Meanwhile, the English naval defense was slow to mobilize, allowing the French, with their hired Genoese galleys, to conduct raids along the English coast in 1339, hitting Portsmouth, Southampton, and Guernsey. A significant French naval assault targeted the Cinque Ports, but encountering prepared Kentish defences at Sandwich, they shifted their focus to Rye And no, that sentence is not a joke. They are just the two names of the town, Sandwich and Rye. Only to face the newly assembled English fleets under Robert Morley. Now, misjudging the size of the English forces, the Genoese mercenaries retreated to France, ending their campaign after disputes over pay led to a mutiny. Now, despite these French naval incursions, England's coastal defences remained largely intact, barring significant damage to undefended locations like Hastings. Concurrently, the English military's focus on France weakened their position in the north, enabling the Scots to recapture key locations, including Perth in 1339 and Edinburgh in 1341, exploiting the reduced English presence in the region. Edward III, under pressure to achieve military success, gathered an army of approximately 12,000 men in the Low Countries by September, drawing from his various allies. With Cambrai, an ally of the French king, as an initial target, Edward's forces laid siege to the bishopric on September 20th. Despite ravaging the surrounding area, Cambrai withstood the siege, and on October the 9th, Edward's army withdrew, moving deeper into France. As Edward focused on Cambrai, King Philip VI of France used the time to assemble his forces at Péronne, near the border. Edward's troops continued their destructive march across a 20-mile-wide swath of French countryside, prompting Philip's army to closely monitor their movements, albeit without engaging in direct battle. On October the 14th, with the French army in proximity, a confrontation seemed inevitable as Edward approached them, but then veered off, continuing his path of devastation. The armies finally positioned themselves for battle in Picardy, between La Capelle and La Flamengrie. But no battle ensued on the anticipated date of October 23rd. At nightfall, Edward strategically retreated from France, ending his campaign without a decisive conflict. And the French? They chose not to pursue them. Meanwhile, the economic ramifications of Edward's embargo on English goods to Flanders, which remained loyal to Philip, incited a revolt in 1337 due to the absence of essential English wool and food supplies. Jacob van Artevelde, leading the revolt, negotiated Flemish neutrality in exchange for lifting the embargo. By December, Flanders was prepared to formally support Edward's cause against Philip, with Ghent, Ypres, and Bruges recognizing Edward as the King of France. This political maneuver aimed to consolidate Edward's alliances in the Low Countries, enabling his supporters to assert their allegiance to what they saw as the legitimate King of France. Back in Gascony, the English defences, already stretched thin, received unexpected relief when two French-supporting nobles, the Count of Armagnac and the Count of Foix, became preoccupied with a personal feud rather than combating the English. Additionally, significant support came from the Albret family, notably Bernard Hayes, the Lord of Albret, who declared allegiance to Edward in the same year of 1339. The Albrets holding a pivotal lordship in English Gascony, provided critical financial and military support to Edward's campaigns, leveraging their extensive family connections to bolster English forces in the region. In 1340, the French amassed an impressive invasion fleet, including French, Castilian, and Genoese ships, totaling around 400 vessels gathered together in the Zouane estuary. Lacking purpose-built warships, Edward III of England modified deep-draft merchant ships, known as cogs, for naval use. Edward set up his command on the cog Thomas and sailed from Orwell, Kent, on June 22nd to meet the superior French fleet the next day. The French fleet adopted a defensive stance off Sluys, aiming to block Edward from landing. Initially feigning retreat, the English capitalized on a favorable wind shift in the late afternoon to launch their attack, positioning themselves with the wind and the sun at their backs. Edward devised a tactical formation, sending ships in groups of 3, 2 filled with archers, and another filled with men-at-arms. The proximity of the French ships to one another hampered their mobility, allowing the English archers to decimate the French from close range before the men-at-arms boarded to complete the assault. This decisive action at the Battle of Sluys nearly annihilated the French fleet, ensuring English dominance over the Channel and thwarting further French invasions. Meanwhile, in spring of the following year 1340, Philip VI of France had planned a major offensive against Edward III's allies, but shifted focus following the calamitous defeat at the naval Battle of Sluys. Edward split his forces. One contingent under Robert of Artois faced a destructive encounter in Artois on June 26th, while Edward himself commenced the siege of Tournai, a significant city which was then a part of France. The prolonged siege lasted until September, when Philip approached the main French army, leading to a stalemate and the eventual signing of the Truce of Esplichin on September the 25th, 1340. This truce paused hostilities for 9 months, marking the end of the conflict's initial phase, but certainly not the end of the conflict. Now, the war's financial and political toll was of course substantial, prompting a reassessment of alliances and military strategies. The German princes withdrew from the coalition, leaving only the Flemish burghers as steadfast allies. Back in England, Edward faced increasing domestic opposition due to the high costs and minimal gains of his continental campaigns, compounded by significant territorial losses in Scotland. The financial strain pushed Edward towards bankruptcy, necessitating selective repayments of debts. While some creditors received full payment, others, notably the major Florentine banking houses of Bardi and Peruzzi, did not. Contemporary chronicler Giovanni Villani, connected to the Peruzzi, exaggerated Edward's debts somewhat, which were substantial but not solely responsible for the Florentine financial crisis. He was probably just trying to blame it on an outside influence. Good strategy. Indeed, the broader economic turmoil in Florence, including the bankruptcy of the Acciaioli a major financial company that had no dealings with Edward at all, indicates that the English king's defaults were, yes, a contributing factor, but definitely not the sole cause of the disruptions. Well, upon the death of John III, Duke of Brittany, April 30th, 1341, a contentious succession crisis unfolded due to his lack of direct heirs. The key contenders for the dukedom were his younger half-brother, that being John of Montfort, and his niece, Joan of Penthièvre, the daughter of his brother Guy. Despite Joan's close blood relation to John III, the recent French laws concerning female inheritance, which had barred Edward III from the French throne, suggested that women might not be eligible to inherit significant titles. Jeanne was married to Charles of Blois, a nephew of the French king, which added another layer of complexity to the succession. Well, John of Montfort did not wait for a royal decision and proactively assumed the title of Duke, taking control of Nantes, the capital of the Brittany region, and securing the ducal treasury at Limoges. Oh yes, that was the important part. By mid-August, he had gained control over the majority of the duchy, including its principal cities, that being Nantes, Reims, and Vannes. However, his swift actions polarized the local nobility and clergy, with only the minor clergy, knights, and peasantry supporting him. This, of course, led to another civil war. Philip IV of France supported Charles of Blois as the rightful duke, which of course prompted John of Montfort to flee back to England and beg some support from Edward III, pretty please. Despite the ongoing truce of Esplechin, Edward agreed to assist Montfort. Thus, Montfort returned to Brittany to rally his forces, but by November he found himself besieged by a French army in the city of Nantes. The city's residents eventually surrendered him up to the French, and he was taken back to Paris for an extended stay in the dungeons. With John of Montfort imprisoned, leadership of the Montfortist faction fell to his wife, Joanna of Flanders. She established her base at Hennebont in southern Brittany, managing to hold off Charles de Blois' forces over the winter of 1341–42. Her strategic leadership maintained vital connections between Brest and Hennebont, facilitating the arrival of English reinforcements, which helped recapture quite a bit of lost territory. In August 1342, further English support arrived with the Earl of Northampton, who landed at Brest and swiftly captured Vannes. Subsequent battles saw the English forces, including those led by Richard d'Artois, score a victory near Morlaix. However, Robert d'Artois, wounded in the taking of Vannes, later died in England, and the French, under Olivier de Clisson, retook Vannes. Edward III himself arrived in Brittany in the late October of 1342, and then he retook Vannes back and advanced to besiege Rennes. The French mobilized to confront him, but the potential clash was avoided when two cardinals brokered the truce of Malestroit on January of 1343. Despite the official truce, hostilities persisted in Brittany, with Edward III finally consolidating control in the May of 1345. The prolonged truce between England and France, officially established to facilitate peace talks and address mutual war exhaustion, significantly impacted both nations. In England, the heavy tax burden, coupled with the manipulation of the wool trade, left Edward III grappling with substantial debts, which he spent the subsequent years trying to clear. The economic strain was evident as the king struggled to balance the fiscal demands of warfare with domestic economic stability. Back to France, under King Philip VI, they faced their own set of financial challenges. The absence of a centralized authority capable of imposing taxes across the kingdom forced the crown to negotiate directly with various provincial assemblies. During the truce, many of these assemblies resisted tax levies, adhering to traditional feudal customs that exempted them from taxation, during peacetime at least. To generate revenue, Philip VI resorted to debasing the coinage and implementing two highly unpopular taxes, as opposed to the popular ones, I suppose. These taxes being the foage, or the hearth tax, and the gabelle, a tax on salt. Now, of course, a tax on salt is serious business, because everybody uses salt. You have to preserve your food somehow, don't you? So a tax on salt was basically like putting a tax on grain or any sort of other common food stuff, going up to the northern Europe and putting a tax on potatoes. It's basically the same. So this was not good for the lower classes, but certainly gets you quite a lot of money if you can keep the people paying it. These measures only added to the already discontent public's woes, and it only really made things more unstable in France. In 1343, significant administrative changes occurred in Gascony, a key region for the English side. Oliver Ingham, the then Seneschal of Gascony, was recalled back to England, and Nicholas de la Beche replaced him. De la Beche's tenure was marked by strict adherence to the Truce of Malestroit, although he struggled to maintain civil peace within the duchy. The increasing insecurity in the region was evident, as de la Beche required a substantial armed escort to follow him around everywhere he went. That ought to tell you something, reflecting the growing unrest and the challenges of enforcing the truce. The truce had also unintended consequences for the numerous soldiers left unemployed by the cessation of hostilities. When you build a wartime economy, you have so many people engaged in conflict, and all of a sudden, they're all unemployed. They have nothing to do. They either get very drunk and cause trouble, or go and start fulfilling careers in other areas. Most of the time it's the former. Many of these soldiers, rather than returning to a life of poverty, going back to being peasants in the fields, formed or joined what were called routier companies. That was bands of mercenaries that roamed around the countryside looking for work. Now, as these groups, comprising veterans from various regions including Gascony, Brittany, other parts of France, Spain, Germany, and England, exploited their military skills to rob and loot local communities. Indeed, they were more just bandits than mercenaries. When a job came up, sure, they would take it on, make a bit of money. Some local lord or noble wanted some people shaken down for some tax money or whatever else it was. But most of the time the more direct approach seemed to be a little bit more time efficient. They were basically turning into the few hundred years earlier Vikings that had invaded. And they were effectively the same sort of thing. Well, of course, these sorts of routier companies were quite a few, and they were notorious for their ruthlessness, often resorting to methods as far as torture and murder to sustain themselves. Your money or your life. The routier companies frequently sieged strategic towns or castles, using them as bases to plunder the surrounding areas. Their presence became a significant problem during the truce, as they would demand ransom from towns to avoid complete devastation. The issue of routiers persisted as a major security concern until the 15th century, when reforms in taxation allowed for the establishment of a regular army, incorporating many of the more disciplined routiers and restoring a measure of order to the regions afflicted by their depredations. Well, on July the 5th, 1346, Edward III embarked on a significant campaign, departing Portsmouth with a fleet of approximately 750 ships, carrying between 7,000 to 10,000 men. Accompanying him was his son, Edward the Black Prince, who had recently turned 16 years old and been titled the Prince of Wales. I have a full video on him, by the way, if you want to go watch that. Well, the expedition marked the start of a major invasion across the English Channel, and on July the 12th, Edward's forces made landfall at Saint-Vaast-la-Hauge on the Cotentin Peninsula. Now, we're very lucky to have a chronicle from Jean Froissart, which describes the events here. So we'll read from a contemporary source now. When the King of England arrived in the Hauge Saint-Vaast, the king issued out of his ship, and the first foot that he set on the ground, he fell so rudely that the blood burst out of his nose. The kings that were about him took him up and said, "Sir, for God's sake, enter again into your ship, and come not a land this day, for this is but an evil sign for us." Then the king answered quickly and said, "Why, this is a good token for me, for the land hath desire to have me." Of which the answer all his men were right joyful. So that day and night the king lodged on the sands, and in the meantime discharged the ships of their horses and other baggages. There the king made 2 marshals of his host, the one the Lord Geoffrey de Harcourt, and the other the Earl of Warwick, and the Earl of Arundel. And he ordained that the Earl of Huntingdon should keep the fleet of ships with 100 men of arms and 400 archers. And he also ordained 3 battalions, one to go on his right hand, closing to the seaside, and the other on his left hand, and the king himself in the midst, and every night to lodge all in one field. End of the passage from the Chronicle of Jean Froissart. Edward III's army progressed through Normandy, committing to a scorched earth policy rather than holding on to territory. Thus, Philip VI of France mobilized a large army to counter this invasion, Edward's forces engaged in two significant battles during this march, the storming of Caen and the Battle of Blanchetaque, both of which ended in English victories. Unable to outmaneuver Philip's forces definitively, Edward positioned his army at Crécy, where the ensuing Battle of Crécy took place. Despite the French numerical superiority, their attacks were systematically thwarted by the skilled English and Welsh archers. The French forces suffered heavy casualties and were ultimately forced into retreat, marking a decisive and, frankly, humiliating defeat for Philip. Well, following the victory at Crécy, Edward continued north and laid siege to Calais, successfully capturing the strategic port city in 1347. This victory was complemented by another English success at the Battle of Neville's Cross, where the Scots under David II were defeated, significantly diminishing the Scottish threat. While the onset of the Black Plague in 1348 stalled further military campaigns as it ravaged populations across Europe, including England and France, straining military and financial resources. By 1350, Philip IV, the sixth rather, had passed away, and his son, John II, ascended to the French throne, continuing the conflict. During this period, tensions escalated between England and Spain due to repeated Spanish acts of aggression against English maritime interests. Well, they weren't going to have that, weren't they? In response to the reports of the Spanish arming themselves in Flanders, Edward III remarked on their continuous provocations and prepared for a confrontation. In August of 1350, the Spanish fleet, laden with armaments and mercenaries armed to the teeth, attempted to pass along England's south coast, targeting potentially vulnerable English towns. Edward's fleet intercepted them at the Battle of Winchelsea on the 29th of August 1350. The battle, which lasted until dusk, saw English archers inflict severe losses on the Spanish before boarding their ships. The engagement ended with significant Spanish losses, capturing nearly half of the fleet, while the remnants fled under the cover of night, mirroring the earlier naval triumph at Sluys. Well, despite the presence of a truce, the spirit of chivalry and rivalry persisted in Brittany, culminating in the Battle of the 30 in 1351. This event was essentially a chivalric tournament rather than a traditional battle, orchestrated between Robert de Beaumanoir, a Breton who commanded the garrison at Josselin, and Richmond Bambro, an English commander at Ploermel. They agreed to a contest where 30 knights from each side would engage in combat with sharpened weapons. The English contingent included renowned men-at-arms like Robert Knolles and Hugh Calverley, although Bambro had to include German mercenaries to reach the required number of 30. The combat was fierce, lasting the entire day, and it ended in a French victory. True to the chivalric ideals, the French victors ransomed many of the captured English knights. That ought to show 'em. Well, like we've said, the Black Death loomed over everyone's head quite ominously, and it reached England in 1348, drastically affecting the population and temporarily halting military campaigns. By the mid-1350s, however, England began to recover, allowing Edward the Black Prince to resume hostilities in France. In 1355, he launched a series of brutal raids known as chevauchées from Gascony, aiming to demoralize the French populace, undermine their leaders, and strain the financial resources of the French crown. These raids involved extensive looting and the systematic destruction of property to weaken the enemy economically and also psychologically. The conflict escalated in the August of 1356, when the Black Prince himself, leading a campaign deeper into French territory, found himself and his army threatened by a larger French force under King John II. The ensuing confrontation at the Battle of Poitiers on the 19th of September 1356 initially saw the English forces, reliable on their formidable longbowmen, successfully repelling multiple French cavalry charges. Good old longbow, nothing beats that. Well, as the battle intensified, and the English archers began running out of arrows, the situation grew a little desperate. However, a tactical maneuver by the Gascon noble, Capital de Buch, led to a flanking attack that captured King John II and even several of his nobles, turning the tide decisively in favor of the English. The capture of the French king led to a significant political instability in France, naturally. A truce was hastily signed with Edward III, and the absence of King John caused governmental functions to falter. The ransom for the king was initially set at 2 million écus, but John, valuing his status, insisted it be raised to 4 million, underscoring the high stakes and heavy burdens of ransom warfare during the period. Well, it culminated in the First Treaty of London in 1358, which established the ransom for King John II of France at 4 million, with the initial payment due by November 1st, 1358. However, the French never paid. In response, the Second Treaty of London was signed on March 12th of the following year, 1359, which stipulated that, in place of John, hostages would be held, including 2 of his sons, several nobles, 4 Parisians, and 2 citizens from each of the 19 upper major French towns. With these hostages secured, John returned to France to raise the necessary funds, while the treaty granted England vast territories, effectively restoring the Angevin Empire. During John's efforts to collect the ransom, his son Louis of Anjou escaped from captivity in Calais in 1362. Ashamed by his son's actions, and preferring to adhere to the code of honor, John voluntarily returned to captivity in England, where he remained until his death in 1364. His funeral in England was marked by great chivalry, honoring him as a noble adversary, and one who acted in the proper and upright manner befitting of a king. Well, meanwhile, France faced internal turmoil with the 1358 Jacquerie peasant revolt, driven by the war hardships and abuses by nobles and mercenary companies. This revolt saw peasants, led by Guillaume Caille, committing atrocities against the nobility in northern France, before being decisively defeated at the Battle of Melun, which was of course followed by brutal reprisals. In 1359, leveraging the instability of France, Edward III sought to capture Reims, aiming to strengthen his position. Despite extensive preparations by the city's inhabitants, Edward's siege lasted 5 weeks but ultimately failed. Edward then moved his army to Paris and later to Chartres. At Chartres, a catastrophic hailstorm caused significant casualties, prompting Edward to consider peace a little bit more seriously. Negotiations initiated by the Dauphin led to the drafting of the Treaty of Brétigny, ratified at Calais on October the 24th, 1360. This treaty saw Edward renounce his claim to the French throne in exchange for full sovereignty over an expanded Aquitaine and Calais. In the aftermath of the Treaty of Brétigny in 1360, where Edward III of England renounced his claim to the throne in exchange for full sovereignty of Aquitaine, relative peace ensued between England and France. Relative. However, regional conflicts continued, notably in Brittany and Castile, which influenced the broader Anglo-French negotiations. The War of Breton Succession, a significant regional conflict, persisted despite the formal peace. The English supported the Montfort family, representing the male line of succession in Brittany, while the French, they backed the House of Blois, advocating for the heir general based on Brittany's acceptance of female succession. This divergence led to prolonged hostilities, culminating in the English-backed Joan of Montfort defeating and killing the French-supported Charles of Blois at the Battle of Auray in 1364. Although John of Montfort secured his position, he had to acknowledge the suzerainty of the French king to maintain his title peacefully, diminishing many of the strategic benefits for England. While during this period of the nominal peace, many soldiers once again found themselves without employment, leading to widespread pillaging across France. These conditions prompted Charles V of France to engage these forces under Bertrand de Gascony, a skilled Breton commander, to intervene in the Castilian War on behalf of Henry of Trastamara against Pedro the Cruel of Castile. Pedro, seeking assistance against Du Guesclin and his supporters, enlisted the aid of the Black Prince, who successfully reinstated him after the Battle of Negera. However, Pedro's failure to compensate the Black Prince and his allies led to his ultimate downfall, with Henry of Trastamara reclaiming the throne and establishing alliances against England. It was this shift that significantly impacted English interests in Castile, culminating in attacks on English merchants and naval raids along England's southern coasts, which shifted maritime dominance back towards France. The Black Prince, seeking to recuperate his financial losses, imposed high taxes on Aquitaine, leading to unrest among the Gascons, who appealed to the French king as their feudal lord. However, by the terms of the Treaty of Brétigny, the French king had relinquished his suzerainty over Aquitaine. The French court, revisiting these terms, claimed that Edward III's renunciation was flawed, asserting ongoing French suzerainty over the region. When Charles V summoned the Black Prince to address these grievances. He refused. Tensions then escalated, leading to the renewal of hostilities in what became known as the Caroline phase of the Hundred Years' War. This phase marked a resumption of the conflict, driven by unresolved territorial disputes and broken alliances. With Charles V resuming hostilities again in 1370, France, as the most formidable state in Western Europe, was very well positioned against England, lacking in strong military leadership. Edward III was aging, and the Black Prince, once a formidable force, was incapacitated by illness. The death of John Chandos in 1370, a pivotal English commander, was just another blow in the already weakened English military capabilities. Under the strategic guidance of Bertrand de Gascony, appointed Constable of France, the French adopted a strategy of attrition. This approach focused on gradually reclaiming territories ceded at Brétigny, rather than engaging in major battles. This incremental method proved effective with the recapture of Poitiers in 1372. A severe blow to the English efforts came with the naval defeat at La Rochelle in August of 1372. An English convoy, vital for supplying reinforcements and funds to Aquitaine, was intercepted and defeated by a Castilian fleet. This loss not only deprived the English of crucial resources, but also heightened their vulnerability to French and Spanish raids, further isolating Gascony and spurring domestic opposition for the war. Jean III de Crécy, Captal de Bouche, an influential Gascon noble fighting on England's side, was captured during these engagements, and, despite his value, Charles chose not to ransom him, fearing his military prowess. So, he was simply imprisoned until his death in 1376, removing another key player from England's strategic reserves. In response to these setbacks, the English conducted several chevauchés into French territory. These raids, designed to devastate the French countryside and undermine Charles V's authority, involved fast-moving forces, burning and pillaging everything as they went. John of Gaunt's chevauchée of 1373 was particularly ambitious, planned over 3 years to traverse from Calais to Aquitaine, and despite initial successes, Charles V's tactics of avoiding confrontation and protecting his peasantry in fortified towns blunted the impact of these raids. The campaign suffered further as English forces, monitored by Du Guesclin's lieutenant Olivier de Clisson, faced numerous challenges. They lost significant numbers of men and materiel while crossing the rivers Loire and Allier. By the time the remnants of Gaunt's army reached Bordeaux on Christmas Eve, 1373, they were ravaged by disease and starvation, significantly weakened, and unable to maintain their campaign. The failures of these campaigns sparked widespread discontent in England, particularly towards John of Gaunt himself, whose political influence was marred by his unpopularity and inability to secure a favorable peace with France. By 1373, the territorial gains England had secured at Crécy through the Treaty of Brétigny were effectively all gone, leaving England with little more than it held prior to these victories. In an attempt to broker peace, Pope Gregory XI orchestrated the Treaty of Bruges in 1375, initiating a 12-month truce between France and England as a sort of permanent cessation of hostilities. The negotiations, led by Philip II, Duke of Burgundy for France, and John of Gaunt for England, ultimately faltered, mainly over the status of Aquitaine. England demanded full sovereignty over the region, while France insisted that it remain under the control of the House of Valois. Despite the Pope's efforts to mediate a resolution, the talks collapsed, and by 1377 hostilities resumed. This period saw personal changes in the English monarchy. The Black Prince had passed away the year before in 1376, and in the following year Edward III had died, leaving the throne to his 10-year-old grandson Richard II. It was under Richard II's rule, and later his disposition by Henry Bolingbroke, being Henry IV, that the English under the House of Lancaster revitalized their claims to the French throne, although substantial military action would not resume until later. Charles V of France died in September of 1380, and his young son, Charles VI, succeeded him, with the county governed by a regency led by his three uncles. Despite the military successes during his reign, Charles V's policies unraveled posthumously. He had ended the war taxes, which were critical for funding the French military efforts. When the Regency attempted to reintroduce these taxes, widespread popular revolts, known as the Harel, erupted, starting in Rouen and spreading to Paris and other northern cities. The regents were compelled to repeal the taxes to quell the unrest. Power to the people. Further complicating the politics was the onset of the Great Schism in 1378, instigated by Charles V's support for the Avignon Pope Clement VII. This schism split the Church and diminished the papal authority significantly, undermining efforts to mediate peace in the 100 Years' War. The fractured papacy, struggling with its internal legitimacy, was unable to exert meaningful influence over the warring factions. Thus, despite numerous peace conferences through the late 14th century, no lasting resolution was achieved, and the war dragged on, fueled by deep-seated national rivalries and intermittent hostilities. And that is the end of part 1 of my history of the 100 Years' War. I hope you liked it, and I hope you can't hear those pesky birds who are outside my window. Perhaps you're more tolerant than I am. I would like to thank my top-tier Patreon subscribers, Stark Factory, Jeffrey, JC, and Susan. Thank you kindly for your support. If you would like to support the channel, you know what to do. You'll find it in the description. Otherwise, you will just have to wait for part 2 of this history of the 100 Years' War, which will most likely come out within the next 12 hours. I know, if you are watching this within the first 12 hours of the video, bad luck for you. But I'm sure you will find a link in the description if you are watching it past that time, as most people I no doubt will. So until next time, thank you for listening, see you in part 2, and good night.